Right, yeah, so I am Victoria Turk. I'm Senior Editor at Wired UK, and I'm delighted to be joined by Shiva Rajaraman, Chief Product Officer at WeWork.
Thank you.
Great to see you here in London. And it's actually very good timing because I would be remiss not to mention that the current issue of Wired UK has a cover feature of WeWork. So I expect everyone to go out and buy a coffee. Shameless plug over. Yeah. Let's get to the session. So, we're talking about how AI is shaping how we think about space. Space, obviously, in this sense, referring to primarily office space, workspace, building space. So perhaps I can just throw that question out to you to begin with. How is WeWork using AI to design and manage space?
Sure. Let me start with a little bit of the context, which is we are large enough now where we have an incredible network of space. So we have, effectively in 22 cities, over 250 buildings. And so for the first time, you can start to see patterns of activity at scale. And then what's interesting for us is because we operate and design that space, we can actually think of these buildings more like software. So the more we learn about data, right, learn about how people are using space, we can actually go in and move the bricks around, not just the pixels. And that's what becomes really interesting for us, is to say, okay, given we've got this data, given we know how teams work together, can we change the space using AI and effectively even more primitive data methods to try to understand what's the optimum space for a given outcome? And that's really what we're doing at the highest level.
So let's drill down into that a bit more. What kind of data are you looking at and how are you getting your hands on that?
Yeah, some of it is, to be honest, is pretty straightforward, which is when people check into a conference room, who's using it. And as we're looking with larger enterprises, sometimes you can use new data sources. So for example, most enterprises have a directory, most often in Microsoft Outlook. So you have a good sense of who are the people in an organization. We don't care so much about the individuals, but we start to roll that up and think about what team are they on. And then we can see how those teams work together in terms of how they've calendared and booked space. Then we can step back and say, do we have the right composition of meeting rooms? Are certain teams always struggling to find a conference room? Could we go in and create a new one for them? Are certain teams doing different styles of meetings? It might be interesting for us to create effectively a new space more conducive to that purpose. Maybe brainstorming is really different than a staff meeting, for example. So we're starting to learn partially through observation and partially looking at the metadata that's in a company today, which is largely their directory.
So you're asking companies to kind of hand over that information with the promise that you can use it to make their experience better?
Yeah, I think another way to look at it is we have to integrate with their systems and it's their data, right? And so we can pull that into the signal, but as you can imagine, most companies don't necessarily want you to look at every single detail of their employee, right? So what's more interesting for us is actually the kind of aggregate of who's on what team. Let's look at how those teams interact. That becomes very interesting.
Great. Okay, and so you gave us an example there of meeting rooms. Are there any other examples where you've learned something from the data, maybe something unexpected, and actually changed how you design a building as a result?
So part of it is, there's always this mix of serendipity and structure in any given building, and we really like to look at those two things. So the serendipity side is how do you design a floor so that people take paths that maybe expose them to different types of people? In some ways, the worst thing that can happen in a community is that you have a bunch of isolated nodes, and they all walk to the elevator and go down and come back up and go back to their isolated spot. We obviously want to encourage that serendipitous interaction between people. And so we start to make paths in these buildings, and we start to study effectively, does that get people to be more exposed to people? And so that's one interesting area, which is just the design of the floor plan becomes an interesting exercise. The other thing is starting to understand, if you will, what does the common space look like when you have an event versus people just hanging out and working? These are very different things. So some of the stuff we're learning right now is we acquired a company called Meetup. And if you think about Meetup, it's one click to bring a group together around some interest. And those interests could be a lot of varied things. It could be yoga and learning to work out for the first time, all the way down to a data visualization workshop with an expert. Depending on what that meetup is, we're starting to test out different layouts of rooms that get people to participate in different ways. So for example, if it's a craft thing, it might be a bunch of modular tables that people can use and then discuss what they created. Whereas if it's much more about, a classical lecture, then you have seating and people can obviously look at a screen. So we're looking at those types of things as well.
So it's interesting you mentioned Meetup, because WeWork in many senses is sort of the opposite of kind of social media. It's a kind of in-person, physical meeting place.
Yeah.
And physical network, I suppose. So how does that work? I mean, where do Meetup and, for example, the WeWork app, which I know your members use as well, how do those kind of digital offerings fit in with the sort of main WeWork physical space product?
Right. So one way to look at it is that you spend a lot of time at work. And so we're thinking much more about what does that community look like? And part of that is just the interactions that happen when you're at work. But what's become much more interesting and why Meetup's part of the picture is that people want to do things before work, during lunch, and after work, and Meetup's a way to bring the best organizers in the world to make that happen. So for example, a lot of people right now are struggling with like work-life balance. How can I work really hard and I'm an entrepreneur, but how do I keep like some kind of fitness or wellness schedule going? So now what we're doing is recommending meetups before work. And so people can sign up for that by being a part of a WeWork. Or you could think about it after work. What's a skill or maybe some level of networking that I want to pursue? So for example, there's a tremendous amount of activity around basically societies around women entrepreneurs right now. And they're all coming together and sharing tips and tricks and thinking about strategies to succeed. So one of those is happening in any city that we're in at any given time thanks to Meetup, so we can recommend that to people to go after work. So it's the same strategy in some ways, which is how do you use space to bring people together? And Meetup's just a richer fabric of organizers who are specialists beyond the folks we have in our halls. And so we're using that together to create a good society.
Cool. And coming back a bit to the tech tools and how they inform the way that you use the space, I visited your headquarters in New York quite a while ago now. And I got to see some of the tech demos that you have there, which go beyond what you were talking about earlier in terms of tracking how people use the space. So there were interesting things like presence sensors, environment sensors, and even experimenting with things like facial recognition and sentiment analysis. So tell me a bit more about how you use those.
Well, let's go back to the problems we're trying to solve. One problem is we'd love to just make getting to work and frictionless. And let me give you an example of that so it puts these technologies together. If I could walk into the building and not have to hunt for my key card, and I could just use my phone and it knows me when I walk in, fantastic. If it knows that I'm a vegan, I'm an aspiring vegan, but I just ate a chicken sandwich, so it's a huge issue. But the point being is that if it knew that I was a vegan and there was some member kind of demoing some food on floor, it would know that and let me know about it. And then when I actually come upstairs and I'm effectively in this environment, what if I'm using a hot desk? And what a hot desk is not my official desk, but a temporary one. What if it could remember the exact level that I like to stand or sit at and automatically go to that when I get there? So all of this is about a train about saying from the moment you get to know me, if I'm willing to reveal information about what my interests are or what my preferences are, remember that irrespective of whatever WeWork I'm in. So it's personalization that we're really focused on and removing friction to get there. We don't want every visit to an office to be about, okay, you can see this in hotels sometimes. They don't remember what room you like. Maybe you like a preferred pillow. Maybe the room that you like, you want a high floor, et cetera. This is all a dice roll most of the time. That's how office space is today. So if we can make that office space more personalized and remember you, then that's what we're experimenting with.
And is there not a risk that this gets a bit creepy at some point? What kind of privacy protections do you put into place here?
So I generally believe in this idea of there has to be reciprocity in the system. So in other words, if you reveal data, then it's for a specific purpose, and our contract is to only use that data for that specific purpose. So there should nothing personally identifiable as well, but okay, if you let me know that I have a standing desk, then use it only for that. And if I'm interested in yoga, use it to give me yoga recommendations, but don't sell me a bunch of ads around other services. So for us, as a large space subscription service, as long as we keep true to that trust and give you reciprocal value, I think we can stay very, very clean and protective of your data, and certainly your identity.
And so how much choice do users have to opt in and opt out? How does the kind of relationship there work?
Yeah, so we're working on some of these things as we test it, but the idea is that any piece of information on that front, you can revoke immediately and wipe out. So we're generally staying very true to you own your data.
And it's interesting that you're talking about large-scale subscription systems,
Yeah.
because your background is in kind of more conventional tech companies, I suppose,
Yeah.
YouTube, Spotify.
Yeah.
How does your experience on those sort of digital tech platforms
Yeah.
translate to WeWork, which is,
Sure.
essentially real estate?
Great question. So just part of the reason of joining WeWork was I like these situations where you're connecting effectively underserved suppliers of entertainment or services with people who are equally underserved on the demand side. Consumers, users, whatever you want to call them. These people who didn't get the products or services they wanted because there were gatekeepers in the middle. So when I look at YouTube, it was largely about connecting creators. You no longer have a green light process. So all these creators thrive who may not have worked in the original studio system. And now their fans are seeing themselves reflected on screen in a way that was never before possible. Spotify is very similar too. Artists having direct linkages to their fan base. And now independent artists rising who may not have been signed by a label historically. And so for WeWork, it's a very similar pattern for me, which is this idea that there's a bunch of people out there who now have access to space. And if we can bundle other services around that, we can de-risk their ability to achieve their purpose, because they don't have to figure out, like they can go to a neighbor and figure out tax policy next year, but they're going to succeed or not based on their creative potential, not because they can figure out something about running a business that's commodity. And if that world really thrives, I think we're going to see a lot of consumers of those services equally delighted. So that's a pattern that connects them all.
And is there any crossover in the tech and the data side?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, I think what I'm most interested in WeWork relative to those other platforms is that we're not just one click to watch a video. And we're not one click to play music and maybe do something else, and that's in the background. We're hopefully one click to meet the right people or build the right community that'll help you achieve your goal. And that's a deeper interaction than I've worked with in the past, and I'm excited about that journey.
We've spoken a lot about how technology can be used to design space, and this idea of very carefully engineering serendipity.
Yeah.
But what are the limits of using data analytics and AI
Sure.
and related technologies to do that? Where does the kind of human element have to step in, and where does technology not help you?
Right. Yeah. It's everywhere. Is the short answer, right? So we have community managers in our buildings, and so I'll give you an example. We survey people in a building, and we ask them what events they're interested in. It's very hard for a machine to then manufacture that event. So we give that data to our community managers in aggregate. So maybe like in the building I work in San Francisco, there's a disproportionate amount of marketers and graphic designers. So they might be interested in certain talks or certain activities. It's the people who craft those things. And then what technology lets us do is get it to the most relevant person at the right time, and that scales their creativity, if you will. But if we didn't have the people actually being the catalyst and source of creativity around that event, it would be a total failure. The machine might recommend something stupid, right, at the end, and definitely not cool. So we're really excited about how people can be amplified through technology, because the flip side is that there's no way a community manager can spend every minute of their life dealing with billing, for example, or trying to understand what different people are looking for. Technology helps them make that more efficient, but they craft a cool outcome as a result.
And I want to ask you a bit as well about Powered by We, which is your system for kind of going into larger companies' headquarters and essentially managing their space for them. So it's a different offering. Instead of companies coming into a WeWork, you will go to them, and you'll use some of the same tools and what you've learned from data analysis and so on to help manage their space. So tell me a bit about the kind of tech products that you're offering on that front.
Sure. So let's start. Powered by We, effectively, you can think of it really simply as someone is bringing us a large amount of space, and they're asking us to envision what it can look like for their employees, and that's largely a study. Then we redesign the space for them, and that often involves a whole new build out, and then we operate it for them. as a service. And so when you think about that, this is actually where things like spatial analytics and utilization are more interesting. Because you're taking an experiment, right? They don't know yet what the perfect space layout is for their employees. So they would like us to have analytics around utilization. Is this conference room being used enough? Do we have enough conference rooms? Do teams that are particularly remote, do they need more ways and standing rooms to communicate with each other, as an example? So one piece of foundation is to step back and say, let's understand utilization better. And that's an analytics layer. The second piece is, what's that programming layer? And this becomes interesting too. Most companies today do not have a good console by which their teams can communicate with their employees. Everyone has like an underused wiki. Sometimes they have 6 or 7 communications channels, and they're not getting this continuous feedback loop of data from their employees. So one of the key things is to create software that's almost like a community management tool that they can use as well, learn about their employees, and cater to them at the end of the day. And then finally, you have a lot of the back office stuff here. As you're designing and building these environments out, there's the more boring side, but it's actually interesting from a data perspective. Procurement of materials. How long does it take to create a space? How often can you update that space and that layout? So we're learning a lot by finally instrumenting, the back office of construction, which is a fascinating and very unstructured space today.
So the more spaces you design and operate, the more you're learning all the time. Can you kind of apply those learnings across the board, or do you have to sort of start with scratch when you get a new building? Obviously, building stock is different.
Right.
It's not going to be exactly the same.
Some stuff I think is common, right? You start to see some really common patterns because we're all grounded humans, and the way we interact and the types of, shells that we live in, we tend to have common interaction patterns that we learn from. But then there's a tremendous amount of regional variance. What we're doing, for example, in China versus Brazil versus the US, culturally is very different. So we have to respond to that. And to your point, a lot of what's important in building design also varies by the region. So for example, what you do for air quality in China is very different than perhaps San Francisco.
That makes sense. Okay, we've got just 1 minute left. So if you wouldn't mind, I'd like you to kind of paint a picture for us of what does the WeWork of the future look like once you've kind of been bolstered by even more data. Some of the tools that you're just experimenting with at the moment have kind of been rolled out across WeWorks. What does that look like? So
fast forward to the future, I'd love a vision where you're starting a company, or maybe you're a big company moving into a new market, and you think that WeWork's the right place for you. In fact, it's the best place for you to achieve your goals. So the second your people are in a WeWork, we effectively learn what are your people interested in, and what are their needs. So we have an educational layer. That's where Flatiron and things like that come in, where we can train them. They start to build a network immediately that helps them achieve their goals with skills that they don't have in-house. So if they need a graphic designer, they need a localization or copy expert to move into China, whatever it may be, they get connected to that network. And finally, they have tremendous flexibility. So as they grow, they're secure in growing into more space as they need it, not before they need it, and at the right price so that they can flexibly adapt to whatever their needs may be. So if we think about that system, hopefully more people will achieve their goals and, really their life's purpose. That's the vision.
Thank you very much, Shiva.
Cool. Thank you.